Sometimes people say 4K saves their older games, and sometimes they're right. Or sometimes they say that 4K breaks the games and they prefer the nostalgia of a release resolution. So why don't we investigate by running some older games in 4K. So to start us off with, many gamers at the time during this era would be using resolutions between 640 by 480 all the way up to 1280 by 1024, and higher than this if you were part of the enthusiast market. I myself, of course, at the time found myself on the lower end of that scale resolution wise, and most consoles from around that era were too, operating the 480p region. However, depending on the release date, I will change to what was more commonly used at the time, whether it be 480p, 720p, etc. So to start us off with, we have Half-Life 1 from 1998, which looked like this on release in the 480p resolution, which is what a lot of people played in, considering that the release copy that I have supports much lower resolutions and software rendering. So this is actually quite a good idea of what mid-range gamers were seeing on their CRTs at the time in the 640 by 480 resolution. There's plenty of detail visible, and there are a few jagged edges here or there, but the detail does appear quite nicely around all the characters and the surrounding textures. In fact, it just looks like a pretty nice game, and it's quite a nostalgic way to actually play it. And I didn't think there'd be much more detail we could actually extract. And to be fair, that was actually quite a right guess, but as we can see in the distance, textures appear to maintain much more detail and our overall field of view was larger, which actually helped the game feel more open and less closed in. Even in comparison between the two, we can see the 4K side maintains much more detail in those distances and helps reduce a lot of the jagged edges. But we do have to factor in the fact that the game is still from 1998, and admittedly the art style and general direction of the game has helped it hold up relatively well today, but it does look a little bit dated, which is definitely nothing against Half-Life, as it is an amazing game that I highly recommend everyone plays at least once. But we can see by throwing the gorgeous Black Mesa into the mix that 4K isn't enough to completely revitalise a nearly 20-year-old game. Still, 4K on the original Half-Life 1 shows us that even in those games that are nearly 20 years old, a little resolution boost here or there can help actually how the games look, with the details that we might have previously missed, clear up the jagged edges, and just make the game a little bit clearer, especially in a game like Half-Life 1 where there doesn't appear to be any HUD issues, aside from the title screen, which is very difficult to see, even on a larger 27-inch monitor. But Half-Life 1 does work and hold up relatively well in the 4K resolution, which serves as a nice little boost over the release 480p that you'd expect to see 20 years ago. Next up we have the likes of Crysis, which is probably one of the most modern games out there that we're going to test just to get it out of the way. And in 720p, well, Crysis, it's a game that's renowned for looking gorgeous, and it did. People were targeting this resolution around 10 years ago, and with high settings enabled, just a few jagged edges threw off the fluency. But aside from that, there was a lot of detail present on screen, but it just felt slightly cramped. It's not too bad if you're watching on mobile, and you'll struggle to notice the jagged edges probably. However, there is definitely some stuff going on, such as the jagged edges and the lack of full texture detail that becomes truly apparent when looking at things like the ground or close-up objects. Do keep in mind this is all with high settings activated, so with lower settings this probably wouldn't be too apparent. However, in the 4K resolution, we see a lot more detail and textures that was previously hidden by the common target resolution of the game 10 years ago. The additional boost to 4K even serves as quite an upgrade over 1080p, which over itself was already very nice, especially considering that 720p was the target resolution 10 years ago. Admittedly, to some people I wouldn't exactly class a 2007 game as being that old, but then someone reminds you that this thing is approaching being 11 years old this year, so it is quite old at this point. Compared to each other Crysis variant, the 4K resolution presents us with much more detail on the actual game due to the way the post-processing effects and lighting hold up. 720p shields away too much detail compared to what 4K gives us, as we can see a lot of details that were previously hidden away are now visible. Sure, it does mean that some of those textures that were previously groundbreaking and looked brilliant do look somewhat dated, but that isn't too much of an issue compared to how the post-processing actually hides this, although the HUD does actually scale well in 4K, so I did have to change my config files to get it to launch in 4K, but actually gaming in 4K seems to work well, and it seems to be quite doable on even a mediocre system nowadays. Next up, we're going to be testing Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, which is in my opinion one of the best looking games of 2005, and although it is still a little bit modern by today's standards, it is 13 years old, which places it older than Crysis, so if we can test Crysis we can surely test this game. It saw itself being played in 1024 by 768 commonly, but mostly was played in 480p as it was released on the original Xbox, and it did still look very good on the console. So considering most people originally played Chaos Theory on the original Xbox, we're going to be using the native resolution of 480p as a starting point, just to see what we were used to and what we can expect with the 4K resolution. And as we can see so far, it does look pretty decent in the 480p resolution, with nice lighting and some decent texture work, which conceals a lot of the defects. But the game holds up brilliantly in 4K, admittedly not in widescreen, but then again, in these types of games, this is something that we'll have to investigate, as the highest it'd go in 4K was still with the 4:3 resolution. The textures do look a little bit dated, and so do the animation of waves and certain things here or there, but that's where the lighting more than makes up for it. In 480p, the game's primary element is its lighting, which was massively praised upon its initial release. And in 480p, the game's primary element is still that lighting, which looks brilliant. It might be a little bit harder to tell the difference between 480p and 4K in some of those darker scenes, but the lighting does hold up really well in 4K, and it is very impressive. The gameplay felt much smoother and more visible and much more detailed. In fact, the game just felt so much better in 4K, and that's saying something as the game was already brilliant in 480p. There was a small issue relating to facial animations, which didn't exactly age well in 480p, and much less so in 4K. They felt more human concealed behind a layer of pixels, but for the most part the game does work well in the 4K resolution, and I do recommend checking out entirely in the 4K resolution, as it presented no issues whatsoever. Something up next that was released on the original Xbox once again with Fable The Lost Chapters, running this time in the 480p resolution, which most of us can agree gave the game both a brilliant atmosphere and some decent graphics at the time. It's hard to line up something like this given the nature of the game, but as we can see, running the game in 480p looks decent enough. But in 4K, as seen by this comparison, well, the details become much clearer with an overall level of clarity to the surrounding areas, as well as maintained by its smoothness and general running of the game. But by now, you guys may have noticed one of the main issues. The HUD is incredibly small. In fact, swapping over left and right, you can see it even more. The HUD just doesn't work on the 4K resolution, and it's difficult to see even on a large 27-inch monitor, so those on mobile are going to have to squint quite hard just to even see it. But the game does look much better, as we can begin to see here, with the quality of water textures, decent details, and pretty much everything being much better in the 4K resolution. The HUD is, well, as you can see, completely tiny, as I mentioned just slightly beforehand, but the actual game was completely playable, although maybe a little bit hard to play without actually being able to see any of the UI that you're meant to actually see throughout the game. It's not that you can't see it, it's just that it's too small to actually see, as you have to flick your eyes between looking in the top right, the top left, the bottom right, just to see what you want to do. It's not something that's easy to look at. This continues throughout most of the game, especially in parts where the map comes in handy to actually locate NPCs and enemies, where I had virtually no idea where they actually were, purely because I saw no red markers on the map, and that's down to the small size of the UI causing that issue, which was, well, not an issue at lower resolutions. The odd thing is, when you enlarge the map, it appears the right size, but the arrows, the red dots, and actually everything like that still scales to the 4K resolution, and are so small you can't actually use them. However, you can enlarge the map and sort of see where you're going. The game was a brilliant experience on the original Xbox as well, and is still a great way to play through it, in fact. That's what I'm using as an original comparison. An alternative to this would be to run the Anniversary Edition, which admittedly does scale wonderfully in the 4K resolution, and looks remarkable too in some places. But the overall game just feels too bright compared to the original, and I love the increased difficulty mode, but the real look of the game just throws me off. It's just not true to the original aesthetic. Whether you're playing in 4K or 480p though, the game does look pretty great, even the original version, and 4K does bring out a ton more detail that I actually prefer on the original compared to the remaster. So really, I do recommend trying to play the original in the 4K resolution if you know what you're doing without a heads-up display. which by now I'm pretty sure I do. Alternatively, just break out the CRT and play the original in 480p on the Xbox or on an old PC. The game is brilliant to play regardless, and 4K does work here if you can get over the UI issues. Half-Life 2 saw many releases, from the 480p resolution on the original Xbox to the PC versions that were actually capable of running from pretty high resolutions on release. However, for the sake of showing a larger disparity, I'll be targeting the Xbox release resolution of 480p once again, just so we can see a larger difference between the actual release resolution a lot of people saw and the 4K resolution that we'll be testing today. And the 480p resolution does look pretty nice, a few details are still hidden away, which seems to be the norm with resolutions this low. However, most people that were actually targeting this resolution were doing so out of a need for performance, so were likely not using the highest settings like we are here. But even so, the actual low resolution did get it running on low-end hardware of the time, as well as the original Xbox console port, which is actually a surprisingly capable port of the game, which I actually played through first. In fact, if we step it up to 720p, we can see what the actual PS3 and Xbox 360 variants were targeting, where detail becomes even more visible, but it seems like a little bit of detail is still hidden away in these lower resolutions. But how does the game hold up in 4K, which is what we came here to see? Well, it holds up very nicely, and of course I mean that it does have the HDR implementation, which helps out brilliantly as it has aged well in the 4K resolution. 4K had no issues aside from the noticeably small menus, which was a little bit of an issue to navigate around, but seems to be an issue on all Source Engine games. The game looked great compared to its sub-HD counterpart, and the 720p variant as well, and I felt much more compelled to play the 4K version given the increased amount of detail present, with a fully complete and working UI to match. Half-Life 2 was brilliant in the original resolution, and it's brilliant in 4K, and it looks and holds up brilliantly today with that little resolution boost. Open Arena, which is based on Quake 3, which was once again played in the 480p resolution, given that almost all console ports of it functioned in exactly that resolution, and many PC users opted for the same resolution to achieve the highest frame rates possible, and the game did look relatively smooth in this resolution, especially considering what some games at the time actually looked like. 480p does actually show most of the detail on screen, but despite this actually being a good looking game, it is an FPS game, so there aren't exactly any hidden details to find concealed by this low resolution. And as can be seen by swapping over to the 4K resolution, the game does appear visibly sharper, but there isn't actually too much of an improvement overall using the 4K variant. It's even less of an overhaul than the original Half-Life. Allowing them to play side by side shows that there are no glitches or artifacts when the running of the game in 4K, and the UI did work perfectly fine. So aside from having to allocate more RAM to the program so it would launch right, there was not really any issues with trying to get a game like this to run in the 4K resolution. So if you've got a 4K resolution or fancy trying out some downsampling, I'd recommend trying this out as it is free to download. Finally, for today's video, we have the likes of Oddworld Odyssey in 4K, which recently received an updated PC port. Not that I was actually unfortunate enough to have many issues with the original, that I actually played on an Intel Pentium M and ATI Mobility Radeon X300, which was my original gaming laptop from about 10 years ago. Not that anyone really wants to hear about that. Now, the old port was decent, but didn't exactly scale well to high resolutions like this game did, so this game seems to set itself to whatever resolution your desktop is in, which is all well and good if you want to play in 4K, as most of the time if you have a 4K monitor, you'll be looking in the 4K resolution. But this also makes it a blind sight harder to actually get the game running in 480p, as you have to fiddle with trying to set your desktop resolution back to 480p, and then relaunch the game. Or you can just do Alt and Enter and set it that way, but I found that to cause some crashes, which wasn't exactly anything major as I was scaling from such a high resolution in the first place. Now, the game was originally played in 480p mainly because it was predominantly an original Xbox game, and upon release it looked lovely with some nice textures and good models, and brilliant lighting for a game approaching being 17 years old. The game scaled wonderfully in the 4K resolution compared to 480p, with much more detail present on the 4K version of the game. However, once again it did reveal some dated assets that were previously masked by the 480p view of the game. Not that I really had any issues with this, as the 4K resolution was very nostalgic for me, just making my old childhood games look so much nicer. So in conclusion, older PC games in 4K. Well, some of them certainly have aged very nicely, and it's been surprising to see some of the games actually working so well 20 years after their initial release and scaling well into the 4K resolution, with of course one of the main exceptions being the stuff along the lines of UIs, which sometimes don't scale too well. One of the main perks of PC gaming is the flexibility with what you get in terms of graphical settings, resolutions, and how you actually want to play the games. So taking advantage of this, we can see that some of those older, more classical titles are even more playable, especially with 4K gaming becoming something much more affordable, with the likes of downsampling making up for the lack of the monitor, and even my old sub £100 graphics card, the R9 being fully capable to run all of these games in 4K. Not that you really need anything too powerful to actually run these games at these settings anyway. Even the likes of Crysis, which was actually very strenuous on systems upon release, is actually quite easy to run in 4K on most modern systems. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope many of you found this as nostalgic as I did. Good night. More regular videos will be coming soon, as I have some exams coming up that I need to get out of the way. But you can always like and subscribe for more content like this, go help us out on the Patreon and get some bonus content from behind the scenes, and I'll catch you guys next in another tech video.